Today, we're going to take a journey through the story of economic thought. And trust me, it's a fascinating ride. It shows us how we've tried to answer some of the biggest questions, from what makes a country wealthy to the incredibly complex challenges we're all facing right now. So, let's get into it. You've probably asked this yourself, right? Why can't economists just agree on anything? But what if I told you that the disagreement isn't a bug, it's a feature? It's the sound of a global conversation that's been evolving for centuries. You see, the story of economics isn't about finding one single correct answer. It's really about the ongoing search for better questions. And you can actually see this evolution perfectly just by looking at how the definition of economics has changed over time. I mean, it started with Adam Smith, who was basically asking, how do we make our country rich? 100 years later or so, it shifted to something much more personal, the study of people in their everyday lives. And then it finally landed on this really powerful modern idea from Lionel Robbins, that economics is simply the science of choice, how we humans deal with the fact that we can't have everything we want. All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the one problem at the heart of all economics. Then we'll trace the epic battle of ideas, from hoarding gold to championing free markets, and see how that whole system came crashing down. We'll look at the big idea that rose from the ashes, government stepping in, and then we'll see how economics is trying to keep up with our world today, leaving us with a conversation that is, well, far from finished. So let's start at the beginning. What is economics, really? When you strip everything else away, it all boils down to one single fundamental problem, a problem that shapes pretty much every decision we make. And that problem is scarcity. It's a simple idea, but it's everything. Our wants are infinite, right? But the resources we have to satisfy them, our time, our money, the planet itself, are very, very limited. And that tension, that gap, forces everybody, from you and me to entire countries, to make some really tough choices. What are we going to make? How are we going to make it? And who gets to have it? Scarcity is the engine that drives this entire story. Okay, now we get to the first big showdown, the first great debate in economics. And it's a debate that, honestly, we're still having today. Should the economy be tightly controlled by the government, or should it just be set free? So in one corner, you had the mercantilists. For them, it was all about the bling. A country's wealth was measured by how much gold and silver it had piled up. The government's job was to be super hands-on, slapping on tariffs, creating monopolies, whatever it took to make sure more gold came in than went out. But then, in the other corner, you have Adam Smith and the classical economists, who came along with a radical new idea. True wealth isn't a pile of metal. It's what a nation can produce. It's about productive labor. And the best way to unleash that? For the government to just get out of the way. And this whole free market idea was powered by Smith's absolutely brilliant, kind of mind-bending concept of the invisible hand. He basically said that when individuals, the butcher, the baker, you name it, all just act in their own self-interest, some unseen force, as if by magic, guides the market to produce exactly what society needs. This idea became the absolute bedrock of free market capitalism. But that invisible hand wasn't invincible. The classical system, which seemed so perfect on paper, was about to get hit by a devastating 1-2 punch. The first was a powerful idea, and the second was a real-world disaster that brought the entire global economy to its knees. The first punch came from Karl Marx. He took that classical idea that all value comes from labor, and he flipped it completely. He said, okay, if labor creates all the value, then where does profit come from? His answer was something he called surplus value. It's the gap between the full value a worker produces and the much lower wage they're actually paid. So for Marx, profit wasn't some noble reward for being clever. It was at its core, exploitation. And this wasn't just some abstract theory for him. You can really feel the weight of it in this quote from his famous book, Das Kapital. He saw this system as a machine that automatically creates immense wealth for a few, but only by creating misery, poverty, and suffering for the many. And then came the second punch. Not an idea, but a catastrophe. The Great Depression wasn't just a recession, it was a complete and utter collapse. A 30% drop in the US economy, that number alone just shattered the core belief of classical economics, that, if left alone, markets would always fix themselves. And the human cost was just staggering. When unemployment rocketed past 20%, 1 in 5 people out of a job, and just stayed there year after year, it became painfully obvious that the system was broken. There was no automatic fix. The classical model had been put to the ultimate test, and it had failed. So this crisis forced a total radical rethink. I mean, if the markets couldn't fix themselves, then maybe someone else had to. This disaster opened the door for a brand new theory that put the government right in the driver's seat of the economy. The man with this new idea was John Maynard Keynes. He looked at the Depression and said the problem wasn't that we couldn't make things. The problem was that no one was spending money. He called this a collapse in aggregate demand. His solution was simple but revolutionary. If people and businesses are too scared to spend, then the government has to step in and do the spending for them to jumpstart the engine. Okay, so this table is a perfect place to pause and just see how far we've come. You can see the whole story laid out, but notice the one question that just keeps popping up over and over again. What is the right role for government? The pendulum just swings wildly, from total control to almost none at all, and then right back to being the active manager of the whole system. But of course, the story doesn't end there. The world kept getting more and more complex. New problems started to emerge. Things like pollution, financial crises, global poverty, that the old debates just couldn't fully explain. The old models just weren't enough, and so economics had to broaden its horizons all over again. And it really did. All these new fields started popping up to tackle these new challenges. You have behavioral economics, which uses psychology to show that, surprise, surprise, we're not always the perfectly rational robots the old models thought we were. And then you have something huge like ecological economics, which completely reframes the debate, arguing the economy isn't some separate machine, it's a tiny subsystem running on a finite planet. Now, a really crucial concept for understanding all of these new problems is something called externalities. Basically, these are the hidden costs, or sometimes benefits, that don't show up in the price tag of a product. The classic example is pollution. A factory can make something for cheap, but we, society, end up paying the hidden cost of a polluted river or dirty air. For a long time, traditional economics was just blind to this. And if you want to see a massive modern externality in action, look no further. Our digital world, with AI and crypto, it feels so clean and weightless, right? But its energy consumption is gigantic. We're talking about it hitting 3.5% of all global electricity use soon. That is a massive environmental cost that the price of a Bitcoin or an AI search just does not reflect at all. So how does this new way of thinking help us solve this? Well, one idea is to internalize that externality, make the price reflect the true cost. So for example, a targeted carbon tax on the electricity used for crypto could raise over $5 billion a year. That's money you could then use to fund green energy. It's really about making the polluter pay the true price. So where does all of this leave us? You know, after this centuries-long journey of clashing ideas and evolving theories, we haven't arrived at some single perfect answer. Instead, it's brought us to a place of constant, practical negotiation.
And this right here is the modern dilemma in a nutshell. When a big recession hits, governments often pull the Keynesian lever. They spend money to boost the economy. But if that spending causes prices to spiral, inflation, they switch playbooks. They pull a different lever, often from a school called monetarism, which means raising interest rates to cool things down. It's a never-ending balancing act.
When you really boil it all down, the story of economics is a story of problem solving. Every single big idea we've talked about was a direct response to the crisis of its day. So as we look at the challenges facing us now, global inequality, climate change, the rise of AI, the real question isn't which old theory is right. The real question is, what new ideas will we need for the problems of tomorrow? What's the next chapter in this incredible, unfinished story going to be?